In 1872, a team of American surveyors entered a northern valley officially marked as empty land. By the end of that week, they understood something no map had warned them about. They were not alone. This is not a campfire legend. It is not a random Bigfoot sighting. And it is not a chaotic monster story. What these men encountered followed structure, escalation, discipline. They were observed from elevation. Their perimeter was tested. A boundary was carved into timber. A warning was delivered during a storm. No massacre followed. Because the objective was not slaughter. It was containment. If you live, hunt, patrol, or work in remote terrain, you understand one thing: elevation controls everything. Position determines survival. And the most dangerous presence is the one that doesn't rush. Tonight, we break down the full frontier account step by step and reconstruct what really happened in that valley. Because sometimes the wilderness is not empty. Sometimes, it's governed. In the spring of 1872, I led 12 men into a valley the maps described as empty. It was marked only as timber-rich land along a northern tributary, suitable for future settlement. I had surveyed riverbanks before. I had crossed hostile weather and hostile men. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what it feels like to step into a place that is already occupied, not by cabins, not by tribes, but by something that does not announce itself. The valley was beautiful in a way that felt almost deliberate. Tall pines stood like pillars in a cathedral of shadow. The river curved gently through the basin, quiet and slow, as if conserving energy. Game trails were visible, but strangely narrow, hugging certain ridgelines and avoiding others entirely. Even before we unloaded the wagons, I noticed the silence. Not absence of sound, but restraint. Birds chirped briefly, then stopped. Wind moved through branches, then faded without echo. If you had been there, standing beside me with boots in damp soil and lantern hanging at your side, you might have called it peaceful. But peace does not watch you. We established camp with discipline. Wagons formed a defensive arc. Perimeter brush was cleared 20 yards outward. Lanterns were positioned at controlled intervals, enough light to prevent blind approaches, not enough to expose our silhouette to the ridge. Years on the frontier teach you one thing quickly: light is protection, but unmanaged light is vulnerability. A good lantern is more than convenience. It is survival. That first evening, nothing happened. Which, in hindsight, was the first sign. The horses grew uneasy after sunset. Not violent, just restless. Their ears rotated toward the northern slope repeatedly. One mule refused to drink. Samuel Reed, the youngest among us, laughed and blamed wolves. I wanted to agree with him. Wolves follow scent. Wolves circle. Wolves make mistakes when hungry. Whatever was out there made none. Shortly after midnight, I heard the first step. Not the frantic crack of brush. Not the scattered movement of prey. A single, deliberate shift of weight on fallen timber beyond the cleared perimeter. Every man on watch froze at once. You learn to distinguish sound on the frontier. This was not wind. Then another step. Closer. If you imagine yourself holding a rifle in darkness, heart hammering, scanning tree line while trying to keep your breathing controlled, you begin to understand the thin line between discipline and panic. I raised my lantern slightly, not high enough to expose myself fully, just enough to stretch the glow outward. And that is when I saw it. A shape between two pines. Too tall. Too broad. Standing upright without sway. It did not move when the light touched it. It did not retreat. It did not charge. It simply stood there. For several seconds that felt endless, I stared at a silhouette that blocked starlight at nearly 8 feet in height. I could not make out facial features yet, only mass. The shoulders were wide, the arms long and hanging low in a way no man's could. Thick outline. Not coat. Not cloak. Form. One of the men behind me whispered, "Bear." But bears do not stand motionless when exposed to firelight. This one tilted its head. Slowly. As if assessing. And then it stepped back into darkness, not hurried, not startled, but controlled. You would think relief would follow. It did not. Because 10 seconds later, a second knock echoed from the eastern tree line. Then another from behind us. 3 positions. Not one. We were not being stalked. We were being measured. No attack came that night. No perimeter breach. No livestock taken. Only awareness, thick and undeniable, pressing against the edges of camp like the darkness itself had weight. Before dawn, I walked the perimeter alone. 25 yards north of our lantern radius, pressed deep into wet soil, was the first footprint. Longer than my forearm. 5 toes. Arch defined. Heel heavy enough to sink deeper than any man in our company could manage. The stride spacing suggested balance and intention. I crouched there in the cold morning air, fingers hovering above that impression, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Not fear. Recognition. We had not entered empty land. We had crossed into territory. And something on the ridge had decided to let us know. We did not speak openly about what we saw that first night, but every man adjusted his behavior the next morning. Rifles were cleaned twice. Perimeter was widened another 10 yards. Lantern positions were recalibrated to eliminate deeper shadow pockets. I ordered tin cups strung along wire between outer trees as a crude early warning system. On the frontier, small preparations often mean the difference between control and chaos. Still, beneath the discipline, something else had settled into the camp, and understanding none of us voiced. The shape on the ridge had not been surprised to find us there. It had already known. Throughout the day, we found more tracks along the riverbank. Not random wandering. Parallel movement. It had walked along our perimeter while we slept. The stride was steady, almost measured, and at one point the impressions turned inward toward camp before stopping precisely at the edge of where our lantern light would have reached. It knew our boundary. It tested it. If you were standing there beside me, kneeling over those prints, you would feel what I felt, the unsettling awareness that the forest was not reacting to us. It was studying us. The second night began quietly. Too quietly. No restless livestock. No nervous shifting of the mules. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Around midnight, the western perimeter alarm rattled violently. Not brushed. Struck. Tin cups clanged against each other with sharp metallic urgency. Samuel raised his rifle before I could speak. I signaled him down and stepped forward slowly, lantern shielded, beam directed low to the ground rather than high into the trees. You do not aim light at what you fear, you illuminate where it will step. Then we heard it, heavy breathing just beyond brush. Close. Too close. A shadow shifted. And suddenly a massive hand, larger than any I had seen, gripped the wire and lifted it slightly, testing tension. The cups rattled again, softer this time, as if adjusted deliberately. It was not tangled. It was evaluating. My heart pounded so violently I could hear blood in my ears. If you were in that moment, rifle trembling, would you fire? Or would you hesitate, sensing that one wrong move could turn observation into war? Before any decision could be made, the wire snapped free from the tree with a violent jerk. Not torn. Pulled. The cups flew sideways, clattering into darkness. One of the horses screamed. Samuel stepped forward impulsively, and that was when it happened. A shape burst through the brush, not toward him, but past him, crossing between 2 wagons in a blur of mass and muscle. It moved with speed that defied its size. 8 feet of controlled power passed within arm's reach of 3 armed men. No swipe. No bite. Only forceful presence. It struck the side of the supply wagon with its shoulder as it passed, denting thick timber as if it were thin planking. The sound cracked through camp like gunfire. Samuel fired. The shot exploded into the night. For one terrifying second, everything froze. Then from 3 separate ridgelines came a response, a deep, layered roar that vibrated through the valley floor and into our chests. Not one voice. Multiple. Coordinated. The message was immediate and unmistakable: escalation acknowledged. The massive figure that had crossed our camp stopped at the edge of lantern glow and turned. This time I saw it clearly. Thick dark hair matted across broad shoulders. Eyes reflecting firelight, not wild, not frenzied, focused. Intelligent. It did not charge Samuel. It did not retaliate for the gunshot. Instead, it stepped forward one pace and struck the ground with its fist. The earth shook under the impact. Then it exhaled a low, resonant rumble and stepped backward into shadow. The roars from the ridge stopped instantly. Silence returned as abruptly as it had shattered. Samuel stood pale, rifle smoking in his hands. The bullet had not hit its mark. I was certain of it. Had it struck flesh, the reaction would have been immediate and catastrophic. Instead, the response we received was structured restraint. We did not sleep the rest of that night. Every man remained armed. Lanterns were repositioned lower to avoid broadcasting our silhouettes. Ammunition was redistributed evenly among us. In frontier survival, redundancy is life. You never rely on a single weapon, a single light source, or a single plan. But as dawn approached, I realized something sobering: equipment prepares you for chaos. It does not prepare you for calculated intelligence. At first light, we examined the wagon damage. The timber was cracked inward by impact force alone. No claw marks. No tearing. A shoulder check. A demonstration. 20 yards beyond camp, the earth bore massive impressions, circling us once before returning toward the northern ridge. It had not fled blindly. It had rejoined formation. Samuel approached me quietly and asked if he had done wrong. I did not answer immediately. Because the truth was complicated. His shot could have started a battle we would not survive. And yet, had he not fired, perhaps the figure would have pressed closer. That is the moral fracture of leadership in remote territory. You make decisions in seconds that could cost lives in minutes. That morning, as I walked the perimeter alone, I found something new carved into bark on the northernmost tree of our clearing. 3 deep vertical gouges, intersected by a horizontal slash. Fresh sap still ran down the trunk. The mark had not been there before the gunshot. The line had been drawn. And this time, it was closer. The mark in the bark changed the air in camp more than the broken wagon ever could. It was no longer about curiosity or testing. A line had been formalized. We all felt it. The gouges were deeper than any claw could reasonably carve at that height without climbing, and the horizontal slash cut cleanly across them like a boundary sealed. Samuel avoided looking at it directly, though I could see the weight of his single shot settling into his shoulders. I did not blame him. Fear makes men react. But now we understood something critical: reaction triggered escalation. We tightened formation that day. No one left camp alone. Water runs were done in pairs with rifles slung but ready. I adjusted lantern placement again, lowering exposure and creating overlapping arcs rather than isolated pools of light. On the frontier, you adapt or you disappear. But beneath all the adjustments, tension coiled tighter. It was not a matter of if something would happen. It was when. It happened before sunset. Samuel and another man, Clark, were checking the eastern brush line when Clark shouted once, sharp and cut short. I ran toward the sound immediately. Through the trees I saw Samuel stumbling backward, eyes wide, rifle half raised. Behind him, no more than 15 yards away, the massive figure moved through timber in parallel. Not charging. Not retreating. Tracking. It was hurting him. Samuel turned and ran. That was the mistake. The forest erupted with heavy movement, not from behind him, but from both sides. 2 additional shapes paced through trees at matching speed. They were not sprinting. They were guiding his direction. Every time Samuel veered, one silhouette shifted to block the angle. It was controlled containment unfolding in real time. If you imagine running through dense forest with 8-foot figures matching your stride without visible exertion, you begin to understand the psychological collapse that follows. Panic narrows vision. Panic kills judgment. I shouted for Samuel to drop and roll behind fallen timber. He did not hear me at first. The breathing behind him was too loud. Then something happened that none of us expected. The lead figure surged forward, not to strike, but to close distance. It reached Samuel in 2 strides and shoved him hard from the side. The force sent him tumbling down a slope into brush. His rifle flew from his hands. For one horrifying second I thought his spine had snapped. But the creature did not descend after him. It stopped at the crest of the slope. It stood there, looking down. Samuel lay at the bottom, stunned but alive. The other 2 figures halted at flank positions above. They had the advantage. Elevation, distance, control. They did not finish him. Instead, the largest one emitted a deep, vibrating rumble, shorter than the ridge roars, more direct. A command. Then, one by one, they stepped backward into the timber and vanished. Silence swallowed the forest. We reached Samuel within seconds. He was bruised, shaken, but breathing. No broken spine. No torn flesh. The shove had been measured violent enough to incapacitate, restrained enough to avoid lethal damage. That was when the truth settled over me like cold water. They could have killed him. Easily. They chose not to. Back in camp, I felt the fracture of leadership more deeply than before. Samuel's near death was my responsibility. I had brought these men here. I had read the first signs and chosen to remain. If you lead men into unknown territory and something stronger claims it, pride becomes liability. As dusk approached, the atmosphere shifted again. No perimeter alarm rattled. No knocks echoed. Instead, just beyond the newly carved boundary tree, a massive stone larger than a man's head had been placed precisely at the edge of lantern light. Not thrown. Set down. A marker. It had been positioned while we were retrieving Samuel. Which meant at least one of them had remained close. Watching. That night, no roars came from the ridge. No movement breached the perimeter. But the psychological weight was heavier than any direct confrontation. We were no longer being tested casually. We had been corrected. I lay awake staring at the edge of firelight, replaying the shove in my mind. The precision. The control. The choice not to kill. It was not animal frenzy. It was territorial enforcement calibrated to degree of intrusion. Samuel approached me quietly before midnight and asked the question none of the others dared to voice. Are we at war? I looked toward the boundary tree and the massive stone resting at its base. No, I said finally. We're being warned. The day after Samuel was shoved down that slope, no man moves beyond the cleared perimeter without permission. Pride had drained from the camp, replaced by something colder and sharper awareness. We were not facing a random predator. We were inside a system. Every escalation had followed our movement. Every demonstration had responded to our choices. We were being managed. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the northern ridge. The wind shifted sharply and began driving down into the basin. Storms in timber country are dangerous enough without uncertainty pressing from the tree line. We secured canvas tighter, checked powder horns for moisture, repositioned supply crates so nothing could be easily overturned. When weather turns violent, preparation is not optional. It is survival. The rain came hard and sudden. Lanterns flickered under shielded glass. The perimeter beyond 15 yards dissolved into gray sheets of water. Thunder cracked across the valley, masking lesser sounds. It was the kind of cover any predator might use to close distance unseen. And they did. I saw the first movement through a flash of lightning. A silhouette standing exactly at the boundary tree. Rain slicked thick hair flat against a massive frame. It did not move under the downpour. It stood upright, chest steady, head angled slightly toward camp. Then lightning struck again. Two more shapes appeared further back along the ridge. 3. Formation. They had chosen the storm deliberately. Samuel reached for his rifle again. I grabbed his arm and held it down. If we fired now, in poor visibility and unstable footing, retaliation would come from angles we could not defend. Elevation belonged entirely to them. The lead figure stepped forward until rain hit the edge of lantern glow. For the first time, we saw detail clearly. Broad shoulders. Long arms nearly reaching knees. Muscle visible even beneath matted hair. The eyes reflected firelight, not in frenzy, but in calculation. It lifted its arm slowly and pressed its palm against the boundary tree. The same tree that bore their carved mark. The gesture was unmistakable. This far. No further. Then something happened that drove tension beyond anything before. From the southern edge of camp came a sudden crash. One of the wagons tipped violently as if shoved from beneath. Supplies spilled into mud. A man named Harper fell backward into the rain. I turned just in time to see another massive shape retreat from the wagon's rear wheel. They had entered from behind. Not to attack. To demonstrate vulnerability. The message was brutal in its clarity. Perimeter meant nothing if they chose otherwise. The lead figure at the boundary tree let out a deep, resonant roar, not wild, not chaotic, but short and controlled. Immediately, the others ceased movement. Coordination again. Harper struggled to his feet, shaken but alive. No claw marks. No strike. Just controlled force. The rain continued pouring. The lead figure removed its hand from the tree and took one slow step backward. Then another. The silhouettes faded into the storm as if swallowed by it. No pursuit. No further escalation. They had proven something. We remained exposed because they allowed it. When dawn finally broke, damage assessment revealed no missing livestock. No torn throats. No bodies. Just the dented wagon, disturbed supplies, and massive footprints pressed deep into rain-soaked earth within 10 yards of where we had slept. 10 yards. If you imagine lying beneath thin canvas with something of that scale capable of entering and exiting your camp at will, you begin to understand the psychological fracture that follows. The storm had not been random timing. It had been stage lighting. They showed us strength without unleashing it. And for the first time since arriving, I felt something more powerful than fear. I felt certainty. We were not being hunted. We were being contained. And containment can end whenever the governing force decides tolerance has expired. The morning after the storm felt different from every other dawn we had witnessed in that valley. There was no restless shifting from the horses. No distant knocks. No ridge silhouettes visible against pale sky. The forest was calm again, as though nothing had occurred. But calm, in that place, no longer meant safety. It meant assessment had concluded. We walked the perimeter slowly, examining the rain-softened ground. The prints were everywhere inside the outer ring of our former boundary. Not chaotic tracks. Not scattered frenzy. Deliberate entry points and deliberate exits. They had moved through camp in coordinated paths, crossing between wagons without colliding, without panic. It was the behavior of something accustomed to navigating confined space with awareness of obstacles. I measured the largest impression again, longer than my forearm, heel sunk nearly 2 inches deeper than my boot could press even when I jumped with full weight. They had not slipped in mud. They had not rushed. They had walked. If you were standing where I stood, tracing those impressions while imagining how close they had come to your sleeping men, you would feel what I felt: exposure stripped of illusion. Samuel avoided eye contact that morning. Harper packed supplies without speaking. Clark inspected rifle mechanisms twice. Every man moved with forced normalcy, but beneath it lay a shared realization. We had crossed into territory governed by something disciplined enough to hold back from annihilation. That restraint would not last forever if challenged. Around mid-morning, I made the hardest decision I had faced since taking command of a survey team. We gathered in a tight circle near the overturned wagon, mud still clinging to its side. I laid out the sequence clearly: first sighting, perimeter testing, Samuel's shove, boundary mark, storm demonstration, controlled entry. There was no longer any argument to be had about what we faced. The debate was only about response. Some argued to stand firm and assert dominance. Frontier pride is stubborn. Others suggested immediate retreat. I weighed both options, knowing either path carried consequence. To stay meant eventual escalation. To leave meant abandoning surveyed land and admitting something stronger held claim. Leadership demands clarity when fear clouds judgment. And clarity had come the previous night when they entered camp without killing a single man. If they wanted us dead, we would already be buried. They wanted us gone. The difference matters. Before finalizing the decision, something unexpected happened. A single knock echoed from the northern ridge. Not three. Not layered. One. Short. Controlled. A signal. We turned toward the sound instinctively. Then, emerging just beyond the boundary tree, the largest of the figures stepped into partial view once more. No storm this time. Clear daylight. It stood upright, massive frame outlined against pine trunks, arms relaxed at its sides. It did not roar. It did not approach. It simply stood. Watching. I stepped forward alone, lowering my rifle to the ground deliberately. My men shifted uneasily behind me, but no one stopped me. I moved until I stood 10 yards from the boundary mark and held my hands open at my sides. If you imagine yourself in that position, unarmed before something capable of crushing bone with one strike, you understand the razor-thin edge between courage and insanity. The figure tilted its head slightly. It did not mirror aggression. It did not retreat. It waited. I bent down slowly and placed my hand on the boundary tree, beneath their carved mark. I did not cross it. I did not touch the gouges. I simply acknowledged the line. For several seconds that felt endless, nothing moved. Then the figure stepped backward once. A controlled withdrawal. It did not vanish immediately. It watched a moment longer, then turned and walked up the northern slope without haste. No additional silhouettes appeared. No flanking motion. The signal was clear. The message had been delivered. By midday, we began dismantling camp. Wagons were loaded in silence. Lantern hooks removed. Wire perimeter taken down. We left no unnecessary debris behind. No waste. No provocation. As we formed the departure line, I cast one final glance toward the ridge. 3 silhouettes stood at elevation. Not advancing. Not pursuing. Observing. We rolled westward slowly, wheels cutting into mud one last time before climbing out of the basin. No chase came. No roars followed. The valley swallowed our presence as if reclaiming itself immediately. As we reached the top of the western rise and looked back, the ridge was empty. Not because nothing was there, but because we were no longer inside its boundary. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than fear or pride. We had not lost territory. We had survived negotiation. And negotiation, in wilderness older than any nation, is victory enough. We traveled west for 2 full days before anyone allowed themselves to breathe fully. Even then, relief did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival purchased by restraint. No pursuit came. No distant roars followed our departure. The forest behind us seemed to close like a door that had never truly opened. Yet every man in that company knew we had not escaped by luck. We had complied. The further we moved from the valley, the more perspective settled in. We reviewed every event in sequence, not as frightened men replaying terror, but as observers reconstructing strategy. The first sighting had been observation. The perimeter testing had been evaluation. Samuel's shove had been correction. The storm demonstration had been overwhelming proof of dominance without lethal intent. The boundary reinforcement had been final warning. And our withdrawal had ended escalation. It was structured. Weeks later, we established a new camp near open prairie land bordered by thinner timber. No elevated ridges surrounded us. No narrow corridors funneled movement. Visibility extended in all directions. The difference was immediate. Livestock grazed calmly. Game trails followed predictable patterns. No knocks echoed from hidden slopes. The absence of calculated pressure felt almost unnatural after what we had endured. Yet even in safety, none of us forgot the lesson. Months passed. Official reports were written carefully, citing unstable terrain, unpredictable wildlife behavior, and logistical inefficiencies as reasons for abandoning the Northern Valley. No mention of towering silhouettes. No mention of controlled entry during storm. History prefers tidy explanations. But word travels differently among men who work remote land. Hunters passing through nearby settlements began sharing similar accounts in hushed tones. Massive tracks discovered near river crossings. Timber found stacked across narrow passes overnight. A sensation of being flanked when crossing certain ridgelines. Rarely any direct violence. Almost always warning before confrontation. The pattern repeated beyond our expedition. Years later, 2 independent prospectors ignored advice and attempted to stake claim near the valley's outer corridor. Within days, their horses refused to move north. Supply crates were found displaced each morning. On the third night, coordinated roars erupted from 3 ridges simultaneously. They departed before dawn and did not return. No bodies were found. No blood was spilled. Just enforced boundary. As decades rolled forward and settlements expanded elsewhere, that valley remained conspicuously undeveloped. Roads bent around it. Timber operations shifted south. Railroad plans rerouted quietly. Public reasoning cited rock instability or soil issues. Privately, seasoned men simply avoided the place. I returned once, many years later, but only as far as the western overlook where we had last seen the ridge. The valley floor below was dense and undisturbed. No cabin smoke. No clearing. No survey stakes. Nature had erased our brief intrusion completely. Even the memory of wagon tracks would have long since disappeared. As dawnlight crested the ridge, I saw movement once more. A silhouette at elevation. Still. Watching the basin below. Not searching. Not hunting. Guarding. I did not attempt to approach. I did not call out. I simply stood and observed from a distance beyond the boundary we had once crossed. The figure remained motionless for several seconds before stepping backward into timber, dissolving into shadow as it had done years before. The valley had not changed. It had simply continued. That is perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. We had not discovered something new. We had intersected something established. And when we withdrew, equilibrium resumed. The frontier teaches many lessons about strength, endurance, and conquest. But the valley taught something else. Territory is not always vacant simply because it lacks fences. Governance does not always announce itself in human language. Sometimes it is marked in bark, demonstrated in stormlight, and reinforced by coordinated presence. If you ever walk remote land and feel the pressure of unseen observation, remember this: survival may depend not on proving dominance, but on recognizing when you have stepped into a system older than your claim. We left that valley alive because we chose restraint. And somewhere beyond the ridgeline, something allowed us to go. Time did not weaken what we had witnessed, it strengthened it. Because as the years passed, similar accounts began surfacing from regions far removed from our original expedition. Different men. Different territories. The same structure. Reports arrived from trappers in Washington Territory who described massive silhouettes pacing ridgelines at dusk. From logging crews in Northern California who found heavy timber dragged across access roads overnight without tool marks. From ranchers in Idaho whose livestock refused to graze near certain tree corridors. None of them spoke first of attack. They spoke of containment. One railroad engineer sought me out nearly 15 years after our withdrawal. His crew had been grading a narrow mountain pass when they encountered persistent obstruction. Tools misplaced. Timber stacked deliberately across cleared lines. On the second night, 3 figures appeared on opposing ridges overlooking camp. No approach. No retreat. The engineer admitted to firing warning shots. The following morning, a massive stone, too large for one man to lift, sat at the entrance to their grading path. They rerouted the line within a week. Official reason: unstable terrain. It was not unstable terrain. It was enforced boundary. By then, I had begun cataloging these patterns privately. Not to sensationalize. Not to persuade skeptics. Simply to recognize structure. Every credible account shared common elements: elevation advantage, coordinated presence, graduated escalation, minimal lethal engagement unless provoked. Territory defined not by fence, but by behavior. The most telling detail across all reports was restraint. If these beings were mindless predators, isolated attacks would be frequent and indiscriminate. Instead, enforcement appeared targeted toward intrusion into specific corridors, narrow valleys, migration paths, resource-rich basins. When men withdrew, pressure ceased. When they advanced aggressively, demonstrations intensified. It suggested population. It suggested communication. It suggested governance. Years later, I met an elder from a northern tribe who listened quietly as I recounted only the outline of our experience. He did not appear surprised. "They have always guarded certain places," he said. "We do not build there." His tone held no fear. Only acceptance. Coexistence through awareness. The frontier expanded aggressively in many directions. Forests fell. Railways carved through mountains. Towns replaced timber. Yet some valleys remained untouched long after surrounding land transformed. When you examine historical settlement maps closely, patterns emerge: blank spaces preserved without obvious logistical explanation. We had walked into one of those spaces. The longer I reflected, the clearer the lesson became. The greatest vulnerability we carried into that valley was certainty. We believed absence of human settlement equaled emptiness. We believed strength and firearms equaled control. We believed preparation meant dominance. Preparation preserved us. But humility saved us. Even decades later, I still hear the layered roar that followed Samuel's shot echoing through my memory. Not rage. Response. Not chaos. Coordination. It was the sound of a system acknowledging escalation and choosing restraint over annihilation. Imagine for a moment that we had pressed deeper instead of withdrawing. That more men had arrived armed and defiant. The ridge formations we saw were only 3. We had no measure of how many more remained unseen in timber. In terrain where elevation belonged entirely to them, the outcome would not have favored us. We survived because we recognized pattern before pride demanded proof. And as stories continued to surface across territories: structured knocks in dense forest, heavy breathing beyond lantern light, silhouettes appearing only at boundary lines, the realization hardened into certainty. The frontier was not empty. It was regulated. And those who failed to read the regulation rarely returned with more than silence. If you stand today in remote wilderness and feel the distinct sensation of being evaluated rather than hunted, consider the possibility that you are not discovering untamed land. You are crossing into governed space. The difference determines whether you leave alive. By the time I was an old man, I no longer spoke of the valley as an encounter. I spoke of it as a lesson. Because that is what it became. Not a story of terror. Not a tale meant to entertain by firelight. A lesson in limits. Many who heard fragments of our experience wanted spectacle. They wanted bloodshed, violence, something dramatic enough to justify fear. But the truth unsettled them more deeply than any attack could have. The truth was that we were permitted to live. That permission carried weight. In the years that followed, a few ambitious men attempted to prove us wrong. One expedition of hunters, better armed and convinced of superiority, entered a similar ridge system farther north. They returned 3 days later without their camp supplies. No bodies were found. No torn clothing. Just absence. The few who made it back spoke little. When pressed, one of them said something that never left me: "We were surrounded before we knew we'd crossed anything." Surrounded. That word matters. Because it confirms what we had suspected from the beginning, that the ridge silhouettes were not isolated wanderers. They were positioning. And positioning implies numbers. It implies coordination beyond instinct. One detail I rarely shared in earlier years was something I saw on that final morning in the valley. As we dismantled camp and prepared to leave, I glanced toward the northern slope one last time. Between the trees, partially concealed, stood more than 3 silhouettes. Not advancing. Not retreating. Watching. At least 6. Perhaps more. They did not need to display full force. They needed only to show that force existed. If you have ever been outnumbered in unfamiliar terrain, you understand how quickly confidence evaporates. That realization reframed everything. Samuel's shove had not been random correction. It had been calibrated mercy. The storm demonstration had not been intimidation alone. It had been revelation of capacity. They could close distance at will. They could flank without sound. They could enter our camp in full storm without causing a single fatality. That is not chaos. That is dominance under restraint. As settlement expanded across other territories, I watched carefully for reports of widespread massacre attributed to enormous unknown predators. None came with credible consistency. There were scattered disappearances in wilderness, there always are, but not coordinated destruction of settlements in structured corridors. Which led me to the conclusion that perhaps their objective was not expansion. It was preservation. Preservation of specific valleys. Preservation of migration routes. Preservation of something we did not fully understand. We had assumed we were claiming empty land. In reality, we had stepped into protected ground. Years later, when I walked remote timber once more far from that original basin, I felt the same pressure in the air near certain ridgelines. Not constant. Not everywhere. Only in specific corridors. The pattern had never changed. It made me wonder how many early settlers vanished quietly, not because they were attacked randomly, but because they pressed beyond a boundary after warnings had escalated past restraint. We were fortunate. We read the escalation correctly before it reached its final stage. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all: the valley did not spare us because we were strong. It spared us because we complied. If you stand today in wilderness and feel watched, not hunted, not pursued, but measured, ask yourself whether you have already crossed a line invisible on your map. Because if we learned anything in 1872, it is this: boundaries do not need fences. And enforcement does not require slaughter. Sometimes, it requires only enough power to remind you that you are temporary. The final lesson did not come from confrontation. It came from what followed after we left. The valley returned to silence, but it was not the empty silence we once mistook for vacancy. It was regulated quiet. The kind that settles back into place when intrusion ends. Years passed. Rail lines expanded. Timber operations intensified across multiple territories. Yet whenever a corridor aligned too closely with ridge systems similar to ours, something familiar happened. Work stalled. Equipment failed inexplicably. Animals refused to cross certain passes. Camps relocated quietly. Public explanations always cited terrain instability or environmental unpredictability. But among seasoned men who worked those lands long enough, a different understanding circulated. There are places you do not build. There are ridges you do not clear. There are valleys that remain untouched not because they cannot be taken, but because taking them would demand a cost too high. One winter, I received word from a fur trapper who had wintered alone in dense timber north of our original expedition route. He described hearing synchronized knocks from 3 directions after setting traps near a narrow water corridor. He ignored them the first night. The second night, he found his trap lines neatly dismantled and laid across his path back to camp. No animals stolen. No tools destroyed. Just rearranged. On the third night, he packed and left. He did not wait for escalation. He survived because he read the message early. That is the pattern most never recognize. The system does not strike without sequence. It tests. It positions. It corrects. It escalates in measured increments. Those who recognize the sequence live to speak. Those who dismiss it may never return to describe what final escalation looks like. I sometimes wonder what would have happened had Samuel's bullet struck flesh that night. Would restraint have ended instantly? Would the ridge silhouettes have descended without hesitation? Would we have been buried beneath timber before dawn? The answer remains speculation. But based on every subsequent report I have gathered, I believe the reaction would not have been chaotic. It would have been decisive. There is something profoundly unsettling about facing intelligence that does not waste movement. That does not roar unless necessary. That does not attack unless provoked beyond warning. That waits for you to choose your next move. The frontier was built on belief in human dominion. We carried that belief into forests, deserts, mountains. But in that valley, dominion was not ours to claim. We encountered governance older than survey lines and stronger than rifle fire. Even now, as I near the end of my years, I revisit that final image in my mind. 3 silhouettes on the ridge as we departed. Watching. Not pursuing. Not threatening. Simply confirming departure. They did not need to chase. The message had been delivered. And we understood it. If you ever find yourself in remote wilderness and feel the weight of unseen evaluation pressing against your certainty, remember this: you may not be alone in claiming that ground. You may be tolerated. Or you may have crossed a line that has already been marked. The difference between those two outcomes will not be decided by how loud you are, or how armed you are. It will be decided by whether you recognize the pattern before the final stage begins. There is a burden that comes with knowledge few others accept. It is not fear. It is not obsession. It is the quiet awareness that the world is structured in ways most never see because they never cross certain lines. After 1872, I could never look at a ridgeline the same way again. Elevation ceased being scenery. It became vantage. In towns and settlements far from heavy timber, men spoke confidently about conquering wilderness. They spoke of expansion as inevitability. They spoke of progress as if land itself had no memory. I listened but did not argue. Some truths cannot be forced into minds unprepared to hold them. I began paying closer attention to frontier disappearance reports. Not the exaggerated ones told in saloons, but the quiet entries in county records. Hunters gone missing after ignoring warnings from indigenous guides. Small camps abandoned without sign of struggle. Pack animals found wandering miles from original tether points. These incidents were always near dense ridge systems, narrow basins, migration corridors. Pattern. Always pattern. The absence of widespread violence was, paradoxically, the strongest evidence of structure. If Sasquatch, or whatever name you assign, were indiscriminate predators, settlements near those corridors would have been decimated. Instead, avoidance and correction were the dominant responses. We had been corrected. The shove that sent Samuel tumbling down the slope was not intended to kill. It was intended to teach. The storm entry into camp was not slaughter. It was demonstration of capacity. The carved boundary was not decoration. It was formal line. And the silence after our departure was confirmation. Years later, I encountered a retired soldier who had patrolled remote territories during conflict in unfamiliar mountains overseas. He told me something that struck deeply. The most dangerous enemy, he said, is the one who doesn't fire first. He understood restraint. Restraint signals confidence. Confidence signals control. That valley was under control long before we arrived. If you imagine standing in remote terrain where something stronger than you allows your presence only within certain parameters, you begin to understand the psychological shift that occurs. You are no longer master. You are guest. And guests who overstay welcome are removed. One final detail lingers in my memory more vividly than any roar. As we crested the western rise during our departure, I turned once more toward the basin. I did not see them clearly that time, but I felt it. The same pressure in the air that had pressed against us the first night. Watching. Not in anger. In assessment. The valley did not need to pursue. It had achieved its objective. Containment resolved. Intrusion ended. Life resumed. If there is one truth I would leave for any man venturing into deep wilderness, it is this: not all silence is empty. Some silence is maintained. And when you feel that weight pressing against your certainty, consider the possibility that you are not alone in your claim. We left alive because we recognized the pattern before it escalated beyond warning. Others may not be given the same opportunity. And the forest will not explain the difference. In the years after our departure, I returned often in thought to a single question: why were we allowed to leave? It would have taken little effort for them to close distance and ensure none of us ever described what we had seen. We were exposed. Outnumbered. Outmatched in terrain. And yet, no pursuit came. No final strike followed. The more I studied the pattern across other territories, the clearer the answer became. We did not pose long-term threat once we chose withdrawal. Their objective was not elimination. It was preservation of boundary. That boundary does not shift easily. I began noticing that land disputes between settlers rarely escalated into violence when one side recognized limits early. The same principle applied in the valley. Escalation only increased when we pressed closer. When we acknowledged the carved mark and dismantled camp, pressure ceased almost immediately. It suggests something far more unsettling than aggression. It suggests governance rooted in stability. One autumn, many years later, a group of surveyors attempted to establish a timber contract near a basin structurally similar to ours. They dismissed older accounts as superstition. Within days, tools were moved overnight, heavy logs placed across graded paths, and synchronized vocalizations echoed after sunset. On the fourth night, one man fired into the darkness. The next morning, their supply animals were found missing, not slaughtered, not torn, simply gone. The men left without retrieving equipment. No bodies. No blood. Correction. The absence of massacre is not proof of absence. It is proof of control. Had our bullet struck true that night in the storm, I believe the reaction would have been swift and irreversible. Not chaotic, but decisive. Because restraint is extended only so long as boundaries are respected. The frontier taught men to believe strength alone defines survival. But in that valley, strength without awareness would have doomed us. Discipline kept rifles lowered when instinct screamed to fire. Observation replaced ego. Withdrawal replaced pride. If you imagine standing again at that boundary tree, rain falling hard, a massive figure pressing its palm against carved bark, you understand that moment was not intimidation alone. It was negotiation. And negotiation requires two sides capable of choice. We chose to step back. They chose not to escalate further. That mutual restraint is why this account exists. There is a temptation to romanticize wilderness as chaotic and lawless. But the longer I lived, the more convinced I became that certain places operate under rules older than our maps. Those rules do not bend for ambition. They do not respond to gunfire with fear. They respond to intrusion with sequence. Test. Warn. Demonstrate. Contain. If you stand in remote terrain and feel the distinct sense that your presence has been noted, ask yourself whether you are at the first stage or the last. Because the line, once drawn, does not move. We were fortunate enough to recognize it before it closed behind us. As my years lengthened and the frontier hardened into towns, rails, and telegraph lines, I began to see our experience not as an isolated encounter, but as a fracture in the narrative of American expansion. The story most men prefer tells of wilderness conquered by resolve. Our story tells of wilderness that evaluated resolve and found it insufficient. The valley was not wild in the sense we once believed. It was organized, structured, protected. We had mistaken lack of cabins for lack of claim. That assumption nearly cost us everything. Even now, when I study old maps, I notice curious blank spaces that persisted far longer than surrounding land. Timber left uncut. Roads rerouted. Settlements curving around certain basins as if guided by invisible hand. Publicly, these adjustments were attributed to soil conditions or weather patterns. Privately, experienced men learned to listen for something else, the knock that comes before escalation. I have often wondered how many early settlers crossed such boundaries and did not read the sequence correctly. How many dismissed the first warning? How many fired into darkness and triggered response they were not prepared to face? History does not record every disappearance in wilderness. It does not document every camp that failed to return. But silence, in such places, is rarely accidental. What unsettles me most is not the size of the figures we saw, nor the force that dented our wagon like thin tin. It is the discipline they demonstrated. They did not overextend. They did not slaughter recklessly. They did not chase beyond the perimeter of their territory once we withdrew. They enforced a system, not chaos. If you are honest with yourself, that reality is far more terrifying than a monster in frenzy. Frenzy can be outlasted. Structure cannot. When I close my eyes, I still see that final image clearly. 3 silhouettes on the ridge as we departed. Not roaring. Not advancing. Simply ensuring compliance had occurred. The valley behind them remained untouched, sovereign, beyond our reach not because we lacked strength, but because we lacked claim. We survived because we learned quickly. Preparation mattered. Discipline mattered. Clear thinking under pressure mattered. But above all, recognition mattered. We recognized we were not apex in that basin. And we adjusted. The frontier was never empty. It was negotiated. And if you ever walk deep into timber where silence feels layered and ridges seem to watch, remember that expansion is not the same as entitlement. Maps do not erase boundaries drawn long before ink touched paper. We were allowed to leave. That is the truth most men struggle to accept. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: in some places, survival does not belong to the strongest. It belongs to the one who understands when he has crossed a line and has the wisdom to step back before the forest decides for him. There is something that never left me after that year. Not fear. Not even caution. It was the sense of being measured. Of standing within sight of something that did not rush, did not rage, did not need to prove itself, because it already knew its advantage. In the decades that followed, I often revisited the structure of what happened to us, testing it in my mind as a soldier tests the weakness of a fortification. Every time I reached the same conclusion. If the goal had been destruction, we would not have survived the second night. When Samuel fired into the storm, that should have been the end. But it was not. Instead, we were shown force and increasing clarity until the cost of staying became undeniable. That is not the behavior of a beast driven by hunger. That is enforcement of territory. Years after our withdrawal, I heard one final account that confirmed everything I had come to believe. A small hunting party ventured too deep into a narrow timber corridor not far from our original valley. They ignored warning signs, strange knocks, heavy breathing beyond firelight, logs dragged across their return path. On the third night, one of them disappeared from the edge of camp without a scream. The others searched frantically but found only massive impressions leading uphill before vanishing over the ridge. They did not follow. They packed at first light and left. No body was ever recovered. The difference between our expedition and theirs was simple. We recognized the escalation before it reached final consequence. They did not. The forest does not always roar before it acts. Sometimes it waits for you to prove whether you understand the line. In my later years, when asked whether I believed Sasquatch existed, I rarely answered directly. Existence is the wrong word. What we encountered was not an isolated creature wandering through timber. It was organized presence. Population. Structure across corridors. That is far more difficult for men to accept than a single monster in the dark. Because a monster can be hunted. A system cannot. And so the memory remains. Not as nightmare. Not as boast. But as instruction. When you walk remote terrain and feel that stillness settle over the trees, when birds fall silent in layers rather than all at once, when ridgelines seem occupied even before you see movement, consider the possibility that you are not first there. Consider that your arrival may have already been noted. Consider that escalation may already be underway in stages too subtle to notice. We were fortunate. We read the sequence correctly. Others may not. And the land will not explain which stage you are in before it advances to the next. That is the truth of the valley. And that is why it remains untouched. Now, as I near the end of my years, I no longer see that expedition as an encounter with something mysterious. I see it as a correction to arrogance. We entered that valley believing expansion was destiny. We left understanding that destiny bends where stronger systems already exist. The frontier forged men of endurance, yes, but it also revealed the limits of endurance. Hunger can be endured. Cold can be endured. Storm can be endured. But calculated dominance from something that understands terrain better than you ever will, that cannot be overcome by stubbornness alone. What lingers most vividly is not the roar, not the shove, not the dented wagon. It is the moment I placed my hand against the boundary tree beneath their carved mark. I remember the rain dripping from bark. I remember the silence behind me where 12 armed men stood waiting. I remember the massive figure watching from 10 yards beyond that line. And I remember realizing that strength does not always need to advance to win. It only needs to stand firm. We left that valley not because we lacked courage, but because we recognized consequence. The frontier myth celebrates those who charge forward. History rarely honors those who step back wisely. Yet stepping back preserved every life under my command. There are still places in this country where maps curve strangely around certain basins. Places where timber grows older than surrounding forest because no saw remained long enough to cut it. Places where hunters feel watched before they hear anything at all. I do not claim to know the full reach of what we encountered. But I know this. The valley was not empty. It was governed. Governed not by written law, not by fence or flag, but by presence, coordination, and restraint backed by overwhelming capability. If you ever stand in remote wilderness and feel that pressure at the edge of perception, do not mistake it for imagination. It may be evaluation. It may be the first stage of a sequence that unfolds only if you fail to recognize it. Test. Warn. Demonstrate. Contain. Those were the stages we survived. Had we ignored them, I would not be writing these words. The frontier was never conquered in every direction. In some places, it negotiated. In some places, it yielded. And in some places, it remains untouched because those who tried to claim it learned quickly that ownership is not always determined by who arrives first with paper and gunpowder. Sometimes, it is determined by who has stood there longest and who is willing to defend it without ever needing to chase. We were allowed to leave. Remember that. Because permission, in wilderness older than nations, is never accidental. If there is one truth I leave behind, it is this: we were not brave enough to conquer that valley, we were wise enough to survive it. When we first crossed into that basin in 1872, we believed we were expanding civilization. We believed maps granted authority. We believed rifles granted control. What we discovered instead was something far more unsettling: control already existed. Not loud. Not chaotic. Not savage. Structured. Every stage followed order. Observation. Testing. Correction. Demonstration. Boundary. Containment. When we adjusted, escalation stopped. When we complied, pressure dissolved. That pattern was not instinct. It was governance. The most frightening part was never the size of the figures on the ridge. It was their restraint. They did not need to slaughter us to prove dominance. They needed only to show that they could. And that is power of the highest form. Years later, I no longer carry fear when I remember that valley. I carry clarity. The frontier myth teaches that wilderness is empty until claimed. Our experience proves something else: some land does not wait to be claimed. It waits to see whether you understand the line. If you ever find yourself deep in timber where silence feels layered and ridgelines seem occupied before movement reveals itself, pause. Ask yourself: have you crossed into territory that has already been measured? Because the difference between myth and memory is this: we did not imagine what we saw. We responded to it correctly. We left alive. The ridge still stands. The valley remains untouched. No town rose there. No rails cut through its heart. No fences divided it. Not because it could not be taken, but because those who stepped too close learned what we learned. You are not always alone in the places you think are empty. And sometimes, survival is not about proving strength. It is about recognizing sovereignty before the forest decides to enforce it. We were measured. We were warned. And we were permitted to go. Remember that, if you ever feel the ridge watching back.